What if I told you that Walmart parking lots are hunting grounds for predators who turn ordinary shopping trips into nightmares? Tonight, we're uncovering 7 spine-chilling true stories from these seemingly safe spaces. From a night worker, stalked by someone who knew his every move, to shopping carts that moved on their own, to a family who barely escaped a coordinated abduction attempt, these encounters will forever change how you view late-night shopping. Before we dive into these retail horrors that lurk in the shadows between those towering light poles, smash that subscribe button, because after hearing what really happens in those dark spaces between the cars, you'll never walk alone through a Walmart parking lot again. Let's move to our first story. Marcus Chen never believed in ghosts, nor did he expect anything more than dull routine from his graveyard shift at Walmart. The fluorescent glow had become a second sunrise for him. Those quiet hours between 10 and 6 were a sanctuary from the chaos of daytime retail. 3 years in, the rhythm was so familiar, it almost lulled him to forget the doors led out into a world ruled by something other than price cuts and inventory lists. Yet it was precisely this routine, the unbroken pattern of comfort and ritual, that was about to be shattered in a night he would remember for the rest of his life. The incident in question began innocently enough during his 2 a.m. break. Marcus liked to step out the back, breathe cold air, and smoke away the fatigue gnawing at his bones. The parking lot, spread before him like a blank page under the sodium-orange streetlights, was almost entirely empty. Occasionally, a truck driver napped in his rig, or an insomniac wandered in desperate for a 24-ounce coffee. None of this unsettled Marcus. But that night, something was different. About 50 yards out, hovering beneath a lamp, stood a figure. Not pacing, not moving, just standing there motionless beside an abandoned shopping cart. Black jacket zipped up tight, hands buried in pockets, face completely invisible in the cast shadow. Marcus squinted, the little ember of his cigarette growing hotter as he tried to make out any detail. All he could discern was the shape, tall, almost exaggeratedly so, with shoulders too sharp, the kind you'd more likely expect in nightmares than in human posture. He finished his smoke, coughed, and turned to go back inside, deciding the cold was biting too hard for curiosity. But the image haunted him. It didn't feel like merely another night shift anomaly. It was as if the figure had been waiting for him, and as Marcus entered the store, a surge of unease traveled with him. Walmart employs a vast network of security cameras. Marcus knew their locations as intimately as the shelf layout in his favorite cereal aisle. The camera feeds are supposed to be comforting. They cover every blind spot and ensure nothing happens unobserved. But as he pulled up the feed from outside, hoping to see what became of the stranger, he frowned. Camera 7 showed only the empty stretch under the lamp, no sign of the figure or the cart. He switched to camera 8, covering a slightly different angle. There, in the periphery, the figure appeared again, but closer than before. It didn't make sense. He should have seen movement, a transition from one camera's field to another, and yet not once did the monitors catch the figure actually moving. Somehow, it just jumped, scene to scene, creeping closer with each click. A chill wound through Marcus's chest. Was someone messing with him? He double-checked for glitches but couldn't find any. The presence felt calculated, deliberate, as if whoever was out there was aware of how to avoid surveillance, how to slip into the spaces between the watched angles. For the next hour, Marcus pretended to focus on his routine, stocking, arranging displays, answering radios. But if he glimpsed a shadow outside or felt a tremor of footsteps that weren't his heart would skip. The anxiety gnawed, slow and relentless. By 4 a.m., dread had replaced all productivity. No longer trusting the safety of glass and steel, Marcus resolved to call the local police. He'd worked enough crime scenes as a witness to know when something demanded intervention. Dispatch assured him a car would arrive within the hour, but the words felt hollow. Marcus decided to check the parking lot one last time, hoping maybe for the closure of ordinary explanation. When he approached the staff entrance, a shopping cart was pressed up against the door. It wasn't any normal cart, though. Inside, it sat a meticulously organized notebook, its cover battered, its pages dense with precise handwriting. Marcus gingerly opened it. The first page was an inventory of his schedule, written in tidy rows. Which days he worked, when he took breaks, what car he drove. Then, his license plate number was scribbled in bold, followed by his home address. The escalation was chilling. Someone had tracked him, mapped his patterns, and waited for just this moment to reveal what they'd learned. At the bottom of the final page, a single word had been inked in stark, deliberate strokes. Soon. The police arrived 43 minutes after Marcus's call. The officers took his account seriously. This was not a prank. The shopping cart, notebook, and all the details were collected for evidence. Marcus, meanwhile, shivered not from the night's chill, but from the sense that he had been living inside someone else's plan. They told him that sometimes the simplest explanation is true. A disturbed individual, perhaps someone with a vendetta or grievance, latching onto a habit, targeting those who least expect it. Or perhaps it was something darker, a stalker who blended obsession with calculation. Marcus listened, nodded, but the explanation never quite fit the terror that clung to him. He took the advice of his supervisor, using the daylight as a shield, transferring to the day shift at the first opening. From then on, he never spent another night in that cavernous store, though his sleep remained punctuated by the phantom sensation of being watched. Marcus's paranoia translated to ritual. He checked his rearview mirror constantly, double-locked, his doors, and let routines falter so as to be unpredictable. Sometimes, he had nightmares, blinding lights, endless rows of empty parking lot, a shadow that always loomed just beyond the next camera frame. But the horror wasn't simply about fear for his own safety. It was that the space he thought of, as neutral, functional, a place of commerce and routine, could turn in an instant into a stage for something quietly malicious. The parking lot, that open field between the world and the store, was revealed as liminal, dangerous, a zone not for people, but for predation. Marcus's story didn't end with a police file, nor with reassurances from co-workers. The deeper consequence lay in his transformation from a trusting employee into a person haunted by what he could never quite name. There were no further notes, no more appearances of the tall figure. The police investigation, like many, fizzled in bureaucracy. Yet Marcus knew he'd survived something that most others would dismiss. A story not about ghosts, but about obsession, surveillance, and the way mundane places can serve as a canvas for the unfathomable motives of those who watch from the shadows. He began sharing his story in small circles, at first with other night shift workers, then in online communities dedicated to retail horror tales. What he learned was disturbing. Similar encounters had happened elsewhere, often dismissed as paranoia. Others described stalking, mysterious gifts, odd patterns appearing in the camera footage. And while some replies seemed riddled with exaggerations, Marcus found a troubling thread connecting all these narratives. Not every haunting is supernatural. Sometimes, the terror is perfectly human, perfectly real, and calculated to thrive in places most people don't notice. Days passed into months, and the memory of the figure faded, tempered by time. But Marcus's rituals never quite disappeared. He still stopped to scan the parking lot before entering any building after sundown. He remained wary of strangers lingering by shopping carts, avoided elevators alone, and rarely spoke of that night in casual conversation. Yet for all his caution, Marcus sometimes wondered about the motivation behind the notebook, the hours spent, observing his movements, the calculated placement of the final word. Soon. Was it simply intimidation, or the precursor to something more tangible? He would never know for sure, and perhaps that was the story's most insidious element, the horror that continues, not in active threat, but in the psychological aftermath, the way paranoia worms its way into ordinary life. The conclusion, if there is one, lies not in resolution, but in the lesson about the places we take for granted. For Marcus Chen, Walmart's parking lot was no longer an innocuous stretch of asphalt. Instead, it became a personal battleground, a site of revelation, proof that anyone can become an object of scrutiny, and any routine, once noticed, can become the basis for a nightmare. For those making the same night walks with keys in trembling hands, Marcus's warning is clear. Vigilance is as essential as any other form of protection, and ordinary safety sometimes depends on seeing the shadows before they see you. Even now, years later, Marcus sometimes wakes in the middle of the night and glances out his window toward the dark street, waiting for a movement. A flicker beneath a street lamp, the shape of someone just standing, watching, waiting. And while the police file remains open, his story persists in memory, told in hushed tones by those who understand that horror is not only what visits us, but what lingers after, in the routines we once trusted, and in the spaces that are never as empty as we believe. Let's move to our second story. Isabella Rodriguez needed the money more than she needed comfort, which was why she took the cart collector position at the Phoenix Walmart, despite warnings from friends who called it the worst job in retail. At 17, with college applications looming and a family struggling to make ends meet, $8 an hour felt like a fortune, even if it meant pushing shopping carts across scorching Arizona asphalt in 100-degree heat or battling bone-chilling desert winds on winter nights. What Isabella didn't anticipate was that her willingness to work the position nobody else wanted would put her directly in the path of something that defied every rational explanation she'd ever relied upon. The night that changed everything was a Tuesday in October, when the desert finally offered respite from the brutal summer heat. Isabella had been on the job for 6 months, long enough to know every pothole, crack, and abandoned cart magnet in the sprawling 4-acre parking lot. She understood the rhythms of retail, the rush hours when carts scattered like frightened animals, the dead zones where customers dumped their loads and walked away, and the twilight hour when her real work began. The store closed at 10, which meant Isabella had exactly 60 minutes to collect every cart from the farthest reaches of the lot and corral them into the metal pens near the entrance. It was monotonous work, but it was honest, and Isabella took pride in leaving the parking lot pristine for the next day's shoppers. On this particular night, Isabella was working the outer perimeter, that desolate stretch near the street where customers often abandoned their carts rather than walk the extra 100 yards back to the store. She'd collected maybe 8 carts and was linking them together in a train when she heard something that made her pause. The unmistakable sound of metal grinding against metal, like steel wheels scraping across rough concrete. Isabella turned, expecting to see another employee or perhaps a late customer struggling with a stubborn cart. But what she saw instead challenged every assumption she'd made about the physical world. A line of shopping carts, maybe 20 of them, all linked, together in perfect formation, was rolling across the parking lot with no human guidance whatsoever. They moved in absolute silence except for that grinding noise which seemed to come from somewhere deeper than their wheels, as if the metal itself was screaming. But here's what made Isabella's blood freeze. The carts were rolling uphill. The Walmart parking lot had a subtle grade, sloping down toward the street to facilitate drainage, yet these carts were moving against gravity, climbing the incline with steady, purposeful motion. Isabella stood transfixed, her mind scrambling for rational explanations. Wind could move lightweight objects, But there was no wind that night. The desert air hung still and heavy. Magnetic force could pull metal, but shopping carts aren't magnetized, and there was no industrial equipment in the area that could generate such a field. As she watched, the train of carts rolled in a perfectly straight line toward the store entrance, their wheels turning in synchronized rhythm, their plastic handles glinting under the parking lot lights like the spines of some metallic centipede. Then, as suddenly as the movement had begun, it stopped. All 20 carts came to rest simultaneously, as if responding to a command Isabella couldn't hear. She blinked, wondering if exhaustion or desert heat had finally gotten to her, when she noticed something that made her heart hammer against her ribs. At the front of the cart train, where there had been nothing moments before, stood a figure in a dark hoodie. He hadn't walked up to the carts, hadn't emerged from behind a car or stepped out from the shadows. He was simply there, as if he'd materialized from the desert air itself. Isabella fumbled for her radio, the standard issue device that connected her to store management and security. But when she pressed the talk button, nothing happened. The radio was completely dead, its battery drained despite being fully charged when she'd started her shift 2 hours earlier. She was alone in the farthest corner of the parking lot with something that shouldn't exist, watching a scene that violated every law of physics she'd learned in high school science class. The hooded figure began pushing the cart train toward her. At first, his pace was almost casual, the kind of leisurely walk you might see from any customer navigating the aisles inside the store. But then the speed increased, and Isabella realized with growing terror that the carts were moving faster than any human could push them. The grinding sound returned, but amplified now, as if 20 sets of wheels were screaming against the asphalt, in harmonized agony. The figure in the hoodie seemed to glide rather than walk, his feet barely touching the ground, as he guided his metal convoy across the parking lot with supernatural efficiency. Isabella ran. There was no conscious decision, no moment of weighing options. Her body simply responded to a primal alarm that overrode rational thought. She sprinted toward the store entrance, her sneakers slapping against the warm asphalt, her breath coming in ragged gasps as adrenaline flooded her system. Behind her, the grinding noise grew louder, more urgent, as if the cart train was accelerating to match her pace. She risked a glance over her shoulder and saw something that would haunt her dreams for years to come. 20 shopping carts moving, in perfect formation, their wheels spinning faster than physics should allow, guided by a figure whose face remained hidden in the shadow of his hood. Isabella reached the store entrance and yanked desperately on the glass doors, forgetting in a panic that the store had closed 10 minutes earlier. The doors were locked, the interior lights dimmed to their overnight setting, the registers dark and silent. She pounded on the glass with both fists, screaming for someone, anyone, to let her in, to save her from whatever was pursuing her across the parking lot. Through the glass, she could see the night crew stocking shelves in the distance, but they were too far away to hear her desperate pleas, too focused on their work to notice the terror unfolding just beyond their fluorescent sanctuary. The grinding sound stopped. Isabella turned, her back pressed against the locked doors, and saw that the cart train had arrived. All 20 shopping carts were arranged in a perfect semicircle around the store entrance, their metal frames gleaming under the overhead lights like the bars of some impossible prison. But the hooded figure was gone, vanished as mysteriously as he'd appeared, leaving Isabella alone with the evidence of something that couldn't be explained by any rational framework she possessed. Store management, summoned by the night crew who'd finally noticed Isabella's frantic gestures through the glass, unlocked the doors and pulled her inside. She was hyperventilating, crying, trying to explain what had happened while pointing at the semicircle of carts that surrounded the entrance like metallic sentinels. But when the manager and security guard looked outside, they saw only Isabella's normal collection of carts, arranged in their usual haphazard fashion around the entrance area. The perfect semicircle was gone, replaced by the ordinary chaos of retail equipment abandoned by tired employees. The security cameras told an even more disturbing story. The overnight footage showed Isabella collecting carts in her usual methodical manner, then suddenly breaking into a sprint toward the store entrance, screaming and pounding on the doors as if pursued by an invisible threat. There was no cart train, no hooded figure, no supernatural convoy rolling across the parking lot. The cameras captured only a teenage girl, apparently terrified by something that existed solely in her own perception. Isabella's manager, a kind woman who'd worked retail for 20 years and seen every form of employee breakdown imaginable, suggested that the stress of the job combined with the isolation of night work had finally taken its toll. Heat exhaustion was common among cart collectors, and hallucinations were a documented symptom of severe dehydration. Isabella accepted this explanation because it was easier than admitting she'd witnessed something that challenged the fundamental nature of reality. She quit that night, walking away from her $8 an hour and her college savings plan rather than face another evening in that parking lot. But Isabella knew what she'd seen, and no amount of rational explanation could erase the memory of those 20 carts moving in supernatural harmony, guided by a figure who seemed to exist in the spaces between the security camera frames. She found work at a small grocery store across town, a place with a tiny parking lot and daylight hours only, but the experience had changed her relationship with ordinary objects. Shopping carts, which had once been simple tools for carrying groceries, became ominous reminders of that night when the boundary between possible and impossible had dissolved under the Arizona stars. Years later, Isabella would encounter other cart collectors who shared similar stories, tales of equipment that moved without human guidance, of figures who appeared and vanished among the metal frames, of nights when the simple act of collecting abandoned carts became an exercise in supernatural horror. These stories were usually dismissed as the ravings of overworked, underpaid employees whose minds had snapped under the pressure of thankless labor. But Isabella knew better. She understood that some places, some jobs, put you in contact with forces that exist just beyond the edge of human understanding, waiting for the right combination of isolation, exhaustion, and circumstance to reveal themselves. The parking lot where Isabella worked was demolished 5 years later, replaced by a strip mall that promised better lighting, improved security, and modern conveniences for shoppers. But Isabella sometimes wondered if the new construction had simply pushed the phenomenon elsewhere, if somewhere in Phoenix, another teenage cart collector was discovering that reality has thin spots, places where the impossible bleeds through, into the everyday world of retail work and minimum wage survival. She never returned to that Walmart, never drove past the location where she'd encountered something that defied explanation. But on quiet nights, when the desert wind carried sounds from far away, Isabella would sometimes hear it again, the grinding of metal wheels against asphalt, the mechanical chorus of shopping carts moving in perfect unison, guided by hands that belonged to someone who existed in the shadows between security cameras, in the spaces where rational explanation ends and primal terror begins. Let's move to our third story. The Morrison family had been on the road for 3 hours when 6-year-old Emma's urgent bladder announcement turned what should have been a simple pit stop into the most terrifying night of their lives. Kevin Morrison, a former Marine with 2 tours in Afghanistan under his belt, prided himself on being prepared for anything. But nothing in his military training had equipped him to recognize the sophisticated predators who hunted families in the sprawling asphalt wilderness of American retail parking lots. His wife Sarah, a pediatric nurse who'd spent years teaching Emma about stranger danger, thought she understood the threats that children faced in public spaces. They were both wrong, and their mistakes nearly cost them everything. The drive from Denver to Albuquerque had been routine until Emma's announcement escalated from polite request to emergency-level desperation in the span of 10 minutes. Kevin took the next exit, following the familiar blue signs that promised gas, food, and bathrooms at the intersection of two major highways. The Walmart that rose from the desert landscape looked exactly like every other Walmart they'd stopped at during their years of family road trips, massive, brightly lit, surrounded by acres of parking spaces that could accommodate the entire population of a small town. It was the kind of place where American families stopped millions of times each day, conducted their business, and continued their journeys without incident. Kevin pulled into a parking space near the front of the store, turned off the engine, and began the familiar ritual of gathering wallets, phones, and the various items that somehow scattered themselves throughout the car during even the shortest drives. Emma, with the impatience of childhood urgency, unbuckled her seatbelt and started toward the store entrance before Kevin had even removed the keys from the ignition. Sarah called after her to wait, but Emma was already several steps ahead, her small figure silhouetted against the bright entrance lights. It was Sarah who first noticed that Emma had stopped walking. Her daughter stood motionless in the middle of the parking lot, her head turned toward something that had captured her attention with the kind of focused intensity that children reserve for things that adults have learned to ignore. Following Emma's gaze, Sarah spotted what had caught her daughter's eye. A white van parked 3 spaces away from their car, its windows tinted dark enough to conceal whatever lay inside. Emma possessed that instinctive awareness that many children have before adult rationality teaches them to dismiss their intuitions. She could sense that something was fundamentally wrong with the van and the people inside it, even though she couldn't articulate exactly what had triggered her alarm. There were shapes visible through the tinted glass, human figures that seemed to be watching their family with an attention that felt predatory rather than casual. The woman in the front passenger seat kept glancing toward Emma, then looking away quickly when she noticed the child staring back, a pattern of behavior that Emma's young mind recognized as deceptive, despite her inability to name it as such. Kevin's military training activated the moment he saw his daughter's posture and followed her gaze to the van. 20 years of experience in dangerous situations had taught him to trust his instincts, and every instinct he possessed was screaming warnings about what he was observing. The van's occupants weren't random shoppers or travelers taking a rest break. They were organized, alert, and positioned with the kind of tactical awareness that suggested professional training or extensive practice. As Kevin watched, 4 adults emerged from the van with a coordination that confirmed his worst suspicions. This wasn't a coincidence or a misunderstanding. This was an operation, and his family had walked directly into its execution phase. The 4 van occupants moved with practiced precision, each taking a position that served a specific strategic purpose. 2 headed toward the store entrance, effectively cutting off the Morrison family's most obvious escape route. A 3rd began walking directly towards Sarah and Emma with the confident stride of someone who expected compliance rather than resistance. The 4th circled around behind their car, blocking their retreat to their vehicle. Kevin realized with growing horror that every move his family might make had been anticipated and countered by people who had clearly done this before. They were being herded like livestock, pushed toward the darkest section of the parking lot, where witnesses would be scarce and screams might not carry to the safety of the store. Sarah instinctively grabbed Emma and began backing toward their car, but Kevin could see that their movements were being manipulated by their pursuers. The woman approaching them wore a Walmart vest and spoke in the kind of friendly, helpful tone that retail employees use with customers, but her words were wrong, her timing was wrong, and her eyes held the predatory focus that Kevin had learned to recognize in combat zones. She complimented Emma's appearance, offered candy, asked questions about their travel plans with the practiced casualness of someone gathering intelligence. Behind the friendly facade, Kevin could see the cold calculation of a professional predator who made her living by exploiting the trust that children place in adults who seem safe and authoritative. Emma, despite her young age, possessed an intuitive understanding of danger that hadn't yet been educated out of her by adult expectations of politeness and social compliance. She pressed closer to her mother and whispered that the woman's eyes were wrong, a childish observation that captured something essential about their situation that the adults were still struggling to process. The woman's smile never wavered, but Emma could see past the performance to the predatory intelligence beneath. Years later, Emma would describe the woman's eyes as empty in the wrong places, a phrase that would give her parents chills long after the immediate danger had passed. Kevin's military training finally overrode his civilian politeness. He began shouting at maximum volume, using the kind of command voice that had once moved platoons across dangerous terrain. His words weren't pleas or questions, but orders. Get away from my family. Call the police. These people are trying to kidnap us. The transformation from quiet family man to combat veteran was instantaneous and complete, driven by the recognition that his daughter's life hung in the balance. The noise he generated wasn't just sound, but a weapon, designed to shatter the careful orchestration of the abduction attempt by flooding the scene with unwanted attention. The predator's coordination dissolved under the assault of Kevin's military-trained voice and the attention it drew from other customers and store employees. People began looking over from across the parking lot, pointing, reaching for cell phones. Store employees emerged from the entrance to investigate the commotion. The careful isolation that the kidnappers had worked to create was destroyed by witnesses, lights, and the prospect of law enforcement response. The four van occupants scattered as quickly as they had converged, melting back into the ordinary foot traffic of the parking lot with the practiced ease of people who had escape routes planned as carefully as their initial approach. But Emma, with the observational skills of childhood innocence, made a discovery that turned her parents' relief into renewed terror. As the Morrison family reached the safety of the store entrance, Emma tugged on her father's shirt and whispered words that would haunt the entire family for years to come. "Daddy, there were more vans. I saw 3 more white vans parked around the parking lot. They all had people in them. They were all watching families with kids." The scope of what they had encountered expanded beyond a single attempted crime to something much larger and more systematic, an organized operation that turned the familiar landscape of retail shopping into a hunting ground where families became prey. Police arrived 20 minutes after Kevin's 911 call, but the evidence of what the Morrison family had experienced was already evaporating. The white vans were gone, vanished into the traffic of the interstate highway system that connected thousands of similar retail locations across the American landscape. Store security cameras had mysteriously malfunctioned during the critical period, leaving only testimony from a family who claimed to have narrowly escaped an organized abduction attempt. The investigating detective, however, took their report seriously, explaining that they had stumbled into something that law enforcement agencies had been tracking across multiple states, coordinated teams that specialized in family abductions, particularly targeting children for trafficking networks that operated with military-level organization and resources. The Morrison family completed their trip to Albuquerque, but the experience had fundamentally altered their relationship with public spaces and ordinary activities. Kevin now carried more than his driver's license when traveling, and Sarah never allowed Emma to move beyond arm's reach in parking lots or other public areas. Emma, now 12 years old, still experiences nightmares about the woman with the wrong eyes who smiled while planning to destroy her childhood, and sometimes reports seeing similar watchers in other parking lots, studying other families with children. The detective's explanation that they had been lucky, that others had not been so fortunate, transformed their narrow escape from a single terrifying incident into a window into a larger horror that most families never see coming. The psychological aftermath of their encounter extended far beyond the immediate fear and relief. The Morrison family had discovered that evil doesn't always lurk in dark alleys or abandoned buildings. Sometimes it wears retail uniforms and operates in the brightest, most public spaces, hidden in plain sight among the ordinary transactions of American commerce. They learned that predators study families just as carefully as families plan their shopping trips, identifying vulnerabilities, mapping escape routes, and waiting for the perfect moment when parents are distracted and children are accessible. Most disturbing of all, they realized that their experience was not unique but part of a pattern that repeated itself in parking lots across the country, targeting families who believed that bright lights and public spaces guaranteed their safety. The case remained open in the FBI's files, part of a larger investigation into organized trafficking networks that used retail locations as recruitment sites. Kevin and Sarah contributed their testimony to a database of similar incidents, hoping that their experience might help other families recognize the signs of coordinated predation before it was too late. Emma's observation about the multiple white vans became a crucial piece of evidence in understanding the scope and organization of the operation they had encountered, confirming law enforcement suspicions that what appeared to be random crimes were actually carefully planned operations with sophisticated logistics and communication networks. Years later, the Morrison family still travels together, but their journeys are marked by heightened awareness and careful precautions that other families might consider paranoid. They understand that their story could have ended very differently, that Emma's innocence could have been destroyed, and their family torn apart by people who make their living from human suffering. Their survival depended on a combination of military training, parental instinct, and a child's intuitive recognition of danger. But mostly they survived because Kevin chose to make noise rather than comply with the subtle choreography of their would-be captors. Their story serves as a reminder that heroism sometimes consists of nothing more than refusing to be quiet when evil expects silence, and that the price of family safety is eternal vigilance, even in the most familiar and seemingly safe places. Let's move to our fourth story. Derek Thompson had witnessed the full spectrum of human behavior during his 5 years as a security guard at the Clarksville Walmart. But nothing in his extensive experience had prepared him for what unfolded in the aftermath of Black Friday 2023. He'd worked every major shopping event since taking the job, from Christmas rushes that turned rational adults into bargain hunting predators, to back-to-school sales that sparked fistfights over discounted backpacks. Derek thought he'd seen the worst of retail humanity, but Black Friday always pushed people beyond their normal behavioral limits, transforming ordinary customers into desperate competitors willing to trample strangers for marked-down electronics. What Derek discovered in the parking lot after the crowds dispersed would teach him that some people view the chaos of major sales events not as shopping opportunities, but as perfect cover for crimes that would make seasoned detectives lose sleep. The store had closed at midnight after 14 consecutive hours of controlled pandemonium, during which Derek had broken up fights over televisions, escorted belligerent customers to their vehicles, and watched thousands of people engage in behavior they would never exhibit under normal circumstances. Black Friday brought out something primal in shoppers, a competitive savagery that retail workers learned to expect and manage through careful crowd control and strategic positioning of security personnel. Derek's job was to maintain order without escalating conflicts, to protect merchandise and customers, while avoiding the kind of confrontations that could result in lawsuits or media attention. By the time the last customer had been ushered out and the doors locked behind them, Derek was exhausted, his uniform soaked with sweat despite the November chill, his voice hoarse from shouting directions and warnings throughout the endless day. His final duty of the night was a parking lot sweep, a routine inspection to ensure that no customers were sleeping in their vehicles, no abandoned shopping carts blocked traffic lanes, and no evidence of criminal activity required immediate attention or police response. The lot, which had been packed wall-to-wall with vehicles since dawn, now contained only scattered cars belonging to employees and a few stragglers who'd remained after closing to organize their purchases or rest before long drives home. Derek approached the task with the weary professionalism of someone who'd performed the same routine hundreds of times, expecting to find nothing more threatening than abandoned coffee cups and crumpled receipts blown across the asphalt by the wind. In the furthest corner of the parking lot, barely illuminated by the perimeter lighting that cast long shadows between the few remaining vehicles, Derek discovered something that transformed his routine inspection into a crime scene investigation. A black sedan sat with its engine running and driver's door hanging open, interior lights casting an eerie glow across what appeared to be thousands of dollars in small denomination bills scattered across the back seat like confetti from some twisted celebration. The money lay loose and disorganized, ones and fives and tens mixed together in a pile that suggested someone had dumped the contents of multiple cash registers, or perhaps a bank bag into the vehicle without concern for counting, or organizing their haul. But what made Derek's blood freeze wasn't the money. It was the dark stains on the driver's seat that he recognized with sickening certainty as blood. Derek immediately radioed for backup while beginning his preliminary examination of the scene. His security guard training taking over despite the adrenaline that made his hands shake as he documented what he'd discovered. The blood droplets weren't random splatter, but formed a clear trail leading away from the abandoned vehicle toward the store, suggesting that whoever had been bleeding had attempted to reach safety or assistance after whatever violence had occurred. Derek followed the trail across the parking lot, his flashlight beam revealing a story written in crimson drops that led around the building toward the employee loading dock where Black Friday merchandise had been delivered and processed throughout the previous week. Behind the store, in the shadows cast by the loading dock and the dumpsters that serviced the entire shopping complex, Derek found evidence of what could only be described as a carefully orchestrated crime scene. Personal belongings were scattered across the asphalt, a woman's purse with its contents dumped out, car keys glinting under his flashlight beam, a cell phone with a cracked screen that suggested it had been thrown or dropped during a struggle. But most disturbing were the 5 shopping carts arranged in a precise circle around the scattered belongings, each cart filled with Black Friday merchandise that represented hours of competitive shopping by someone who would never make it home to enjoy their bargains. The shopping carts contained exactly the kind of high-value electronics and designer items that Black Friday shoppers fought over inside the store. Tablets, gaming consoles, expensive toys, clothing with designer labels, still attached. Someone had risked injury and exhaustion to acquire these items during the chaos of the sale, only to have their victory transformed into victimization in the dark anonymity of the parking lot after closing time. Derek opened the abandoned purse and found a driver's license identifying the victim as Patricia Hendricks, a 43-year-old woman from a local address who smiled optimistically from her license photo, unaware that her image would soon become evidence in a criminal investigation. As Derek called 911 and waited for police response, he became aware of movement in his peripheral vision that made him realize his discovery of the crime scene had not gone unnoticed by whoever was responsible for creating it. 4 figures stood motionless in the tree line behind the store, barely visible in the darkness but clearly watching his every move with the kind of predatory attention that suggested they were evaluating him as either a threat to be eliminated or a witness to be intimidated. Derek had worked security long enough to recognize when he was being stalked, and every instinct he possessed screamed warnings about the tactical disadvantage of his position, alone, in the dark, surrounded by potential escape routes that his watchers obviously knew better than he did. The figures in the trees didn't attempt to hide or flee when Derek shined his flashlight in their direction, which terrified him more than if they had run or taken cover. Their stillness suggested confidence, organization, and most frighteningly, a lack of concern about being identified or apprehended. These weren't panicked criminals fleeing the scene of an opportunistic crime. They were professional predators who had planned their operation carefully and were now assessing whether Derek represented a complication that needed to be addressed immediately or could be managed through other means. Police arrived with impressive speed, 6 patrol units responding to what dispatch had classified as a potential homicide in progress based on Derek's description of the blood evidence and the ongoing surveillance by unknown subjects. The crime scene processing revealed the sophisticated nature of what Patricia Hendricks had encountered during her Black Friday shopping trip. Hidden among her scattered belongings, investigators found her cell phone, which showed that her last action had been an attempt to call 911 for help. The call had never connected, because someone had deployed a military-grade signal jammer to block all cellular communication in the area around the store, ensuring that victims couldn't summon assistance and that their crimes could be completed, without interference from law enforcement or security services. The investigation into Patricia Hendricks' murder, for that's what it became when her body was found 12 hours later in a drainage ditch 3 miles from the Walmart, revealed that Derek had stumbled into the aftermath of something much larger and more organized than a simple robbery gone wrong. Detective interviews with other Black Friday shoppers uncovered reports of suspicious activity throughout the day. Individuals who seemed more interested in observing customers than shopping, vehicles that followed shoppers to their cars, and incidents of customers being approached in the parking lot by people claiming to be store employees or security personnel. Patricia had been targeted not randomly, but as part of a coordinated operation that used the chaos and crowds of Black Friday as cover for systematic predation. The $8,000 found in Patricia's abandoned car was never recovered. But more disturbing was the evidence that her attackers had used sophisticated equipment and tactics, suggesting military or law enforcement training. The signal jammers, the coordinated surveillance, the tactical positioning of the watchers in the trees, everything pointed to an organized criminal enterprise that had studied law enforcement response times, security protocols, and the behavioral patterns of both shoppers and retail employees. Patricia Hendricks had fought back against people who made their living by exploiting the trust and vulnerability of ordinary consumers, and her resistance had cost her life. Derek Thompson quit his security job 2 weeks after Patricia's murder, unable to continue working in an environment where he now understood the true scope of the dangers that lurked in the shadows of everyday commercial activity. The detective assigned to the case explained that similar incidents had been reported at retail locations across the region, always during major shopping events when crowds provided cover and distraction for organized criminal activity. Black Friday, Christmas shopping, back-to-school sales, any event that brought large numbers of people carrying cash and valuable merchandise to predictable locations became an opportunity for predators who had learned to weaponize the rhythms of consumer culture. The watchers in the trees were never identified or apprehended, vanishing into the interstate highway system that connected thousands of similar retail locations across the American landscape. Derek's testimony became part of a federal investigation into organized retail crime that revealed the existence of networks spanning multiple states, groups that specialized in targeting shoppers during peak retail periods using tactics borrowed from military special operations and organized crime syndicates. Patricia Hendricks became a statistic in a database that tracked similar crimes, her death serving as evidence of how sophisticated modern predators had become in exploiting the vulnerabilities created by mass consumer culture. Derek now works day shift security at a small office building in a different town, but every November he finds himself thinking about Patricia Hendricks and the figures who watched him from the darkness while he processed the scene of her final moments. He wonders how many other Black Friday shoppers never made it home with their bargains, how many other families received phone calls from hospitals or morgues instead of excited reports about successful shopping trips. The retail calendar that once seemed innocent, seasonal sales and promotional events, now appears to Derek as a hunting schedule used by predators who understand that American consumers are most vulnerable when they're focused on acquiring things rather than protecting themselves. The Clarksville Walmart still holds Black Friday sales every year, and shoppers still fight over discounted electronics and designer merchandise with the same competitive intensity that Patricia Hendricks brought to her final shopping trip. But Derek's story serves as a reminder that some people view the chaos and crowds not as shopping opportunities, but as perfect conditions for crimes that transform retail parking lots into hunting grounds where ordinary citizens become prey for predators who have learned to hide their violence in plain sight among the ordinary transactions of American commerce. Let's move to our fifth story. Priya Patel had always considered herself digitally savvy, the kind of person who understood the risks and benefits of online dating in the modern world. At 26, she worked as a software developer for a tech company in Austin, spent her days debugging code and securing networks, and believed that her technical background gave her an edge in recognizing digital deceptions and online predators. She used dating apps with careful protocols, fake names for initial conversations, separate email accounts, reverse image searches on profile photos, and meetings only in public places with good lighting and plenty of witnesses. What Priya didn't understand was that the most dangerous predators had evolved beyond simple catfishing schemes, developing sophisticated operations that turned her own safety protocols against her and used her professional competence as a weapon to lower her guard. James had been messaging with Priya for 3 weeks through a popular dating app, and their conversations had progressed through all the stages that typically indicated genuine interest and compatibility. His messages demonstrated intelligence, humor, and shared interests in technology and hiking. He asked thoughtful questions about her work without being intrusive, shared appropriate details about his own career in marketing, and never pushed for personal information or suggested meeting before Priya felt comfortable. Their text exchanges felt natural and unforced, building the kind of rapport that suggested potential for a real relationship rather than the superficial interactions that characterized most dating app conversations. When James finally suggested meeting in person, his approach seemed perfectly reasonable. A casual dinner at a Thai restaurant near a Walmart, with the parking lot serving as a convenient and well-lit meeting point where they could both feel safe. Priya arrived at the designated Walmart parking lot at exactly 9 p.m., having spent 2 hours preparing for what she hoped might be the beginning of something meaningful. She'd chosen her outfit carefully, professional but attractive, suitable for dinner but not overly revealing, and had taken the precautions that any experienced online dater would consider standard. She told her roommate where she was going, shared James's profile information, and planned to check in periodically throughout the evening. The parking lot appeared exactly as she'd expected, busy enough to provide security through visibility, well lit enough to discourage criminal activity, and public enough that any dangerous behavior would immediately attract attention from other shoppers and store employees. James had texted her final instructions. Look for a blue Honda Civic parked near the garden center. He'd be waiting inside the car and they could walk to the restaurant together. Priya walked confidently across the parking lot, scanning the area near the garden center for the specified vehicle, while mentally rehearsing the polite small talk that would carry them through the initial awkwardness of meeting someone in person. After weeks of digital communication, but as she reached the designated area, she realized that no blue Honda Civic was visible anywhere in the vicinity. She double-checked the location, walked a wider circle around the garden center, and finally sent James a text message asking for clarification about his exact position. His response came immediately, which should have been reassuring, but instead triggered the first whisper of unease in Priya's mind. Having trouble finding parking. Walk toward the back of the lot. I'm circling around looking for a space. The suggestion violated every safety protocol Priya had established for online dating meetings, asking her to move away from the busy, well-lit area near the store entrance toward the darker, more isolated section of the parking lot, where witnesses would be scarce and escape routes limited. But James's explanation seemed reasonable, and his tone remained friendly and apologetic. So Priya began walking toward the back of the lot, while continuing to scan for the blue Honda that represented her connection to someone she hoped might become important in her life. Her phone rang as she walked, displaying James's number and his familiar contact information from their weeks of conversation. His voice sounded different from what she'd expected. Deeper, older, with an accent she couldn't quite place. But voice calls always sounded different from text messages, and Priya attributed the discrepancy to the normal differences between written and spoken communication. "I can see you," James said, his tone warm and reassuring. "Keep walking straight ahead. You're almost there." But as Priya looked around the increasingly empty section of parking lot, she couldn't see anyone, waiting in a car or standing near a vehicle who might be her date. The disconnect between James's claim that he could see her and her inability to locate him triggered alarm bells that her technical background had trained her to recognize as indicators of deception or misdirection. Priya stopped walking and made a decision that probably saved her life. "James, I don't see you anywhere. Let's just meet at the restaurant instead. I'll drive over there now." The pause that followed her words stretched longer than any normal conversation would accommodate, and when James finally responded, his laugh carried a tone that made Priya's skin crawl. It wasn't the nervous laughter of someone dealing with an awkward misunderstanding or the frustrated amusement of someone dealing with parking difficulties. It was the confident, predatory laughter of someone who had been playing a game and was now revealing that the rules were different from what his opponent had understood. "Turn around, Priya," James said, and the use of her real name hit her like a physical blow to the stomach. Throughout their entire 3-week conversation, she had been using the fake name Sarah that she employed for all initial dating app interactions. She had never told James her real name, never given him any information that could have led to discovering her actual identity, yet he knew exactly who she was and where to find her. The revelation transformed what had seemed like a normal dating app interaction into something much more sinister, a carefully orchestrated deception that had been running far longer than the 3 weeks of their text conversations. Priya turned around and saw a man standing about 20 feet behind her, close enough to block her path back to the store, but far enough away to remain partially concealed in the dim lighting of the parking lot's outer reaches. He wasn't holding a phone, which meant he'd been using some kind of hands-free device during their conversation, a level of technological preparation that suggested planning and premeditation rather than spontaneous criminal opportunity. The man wasn't alone. Priya could see other figures moving in her peripheral vision, positioning themselves to cut off potential escape routes with the kind of coordinated precision that indicated extensive practice in this type of operation. Instead of trying to negotiate or understand what was happening, Priya made another decision that probably saved her life. She ran. Not toward the store entrance, which was blocked by the coordinated positioning of her pursuers, but toward the street, hoping to reach traffic and witnesses before whatever was planned for her could be completed. But as she ran, car engines started around her. Not one or two vehicles, but multiple cars that had been sitting silent in the parking lot with their occupants waiting for exactly this moment. The empty parking spaces she had walked past contained vehicles full of people who were all part of the same operation, positioned to control her movement and eliminate her options for escape. 3 cars moved to block her path to the street, while a 4th positioned itself to cut off her retreat toward the store. Priya found herself surrounded in the middle of the parking lot by people who had been waiting for her to arrive. People who knew her real name and had been studying her habits and vulnerabilities for far longer than the 3 weeks of their dating app conversation. She realized with growing terror that she was experiencing something far more sophisticated than a simple robbery or assault. This was an organized abduction attempt involving multiple vehicles, extensive surveillance, and coordination that suggested professional training or extensive experience in human trafficking operations. Priya's response was pure instinct rather than calculated strategy. She started screaming. Not words or pleas for help, but raw, primal screaming at maximum volume while running toward the brightest lights she could find. Her screams weren't designed to communicate specific information, but to shatter the careful orchestration of the abduction by flooding the area with noise and attention. The sound cut through the ambient noise of the parking lot like a siren, immediately attracting the attention of other shoppers, store employees, and security personnel who rushed toward the disturbance to investigate what was causing such obvious distress. The organized precision of the abduction attempt collapsed under the assault of unwanted attention and potential witnesses. The multiple vehicles that had been coordinating Priya's capture scattered as quickly as they had converged, disappearing back into the normal traffic flow of the parking lot before law enforcement could respond to the store employees' emergency calls. Priya reached the safety of the store entrance where the night manager pulled her inside and immediately called police. But by the time officers arrived to investigate, the evidence of what she had experienced had evaporated into the anonymous flow of retail traffic. The police investigation revealed the sophisticated nature of what Priya had escaped. James was revealed to be a completely fabricated identity created using stolen photographs and a burner phone purchased with untraceable cash. The dating app profile had been carefully constructed using social media information harvested from Priya's online presence, allowing her stalkers to create the illusion of compatibility and shared interests while actually conducting surveillance on her habits, work schedule, and personal vulnerabilities. Most disturbing was the discovery that someone had been monitoring Priya's digital activity for months before the fake dating profile ever made contact, building a comprehensive understanding of her personality, preferences, and psychological triggers that allowed them to craft their deception with devastating effectiveness. Priya learned that she was the 7th woman in the Austin area to report similar encounters over the past year, and law enforcement suspected that the actual number of attempts was much higher, given how many victims might never report such incidents due to embarrassment, self-blame, or fear of not being believed. The pattern was consistent across all cases. Months of digital surveillance, fake dating profiles crafted to exploit specific psychological vulnerabilities, meetings arranged at retail locations during evening hours, and attempted abductions, using multiple vehicles and coordinated tactics that suggested military or law enforcement training among the perpetrators. The FBI agent assigned to the case explained that Priya had stumbled into a human trafficking recruitment operation that used modern technology and social media to identify, study, and target victims with unprecedented precision. The traditional model of trafficking that relied on physical coercion or exploitation of existing vulnerabilities had evolved into something much more sophisticated, operations that used digital forensics and psychological profiling to create the illusion of romantic connection while actually conducting predatory surveillance. Priya's technical background and careful safety protocols had been weaponized against her by people who understood that the most effective deceptions exploit their victims' perceived strengths rather than their obvious weaknesses. Priya now works as a digital safety consultant, teaching other women how to recognize the signs of sophisticated online predation and protect themselves from trafficking recruitment operations that use dating apps as hunting grounds. She hasn't used any dating platform since that night in the Walmart parking lot, unable to trust that any online interaction might not be part of a larger surveillance operation designed to identify and exploit her vulnerabilities. Her story serves as a warning about how technological sophistication has changed the nature of predation, transforming parking lots and public spaces into stages for crimes that begin in the digital realm and culminate in physical abduction attempts. That would have been impossible before the age of social media and smartphone surveillance. The most chilling aspect of Priya's experience isn't what happened to her, but what happened to the other 6 women who reported similar encounters but weren't fortunate enough to escape. Their cases remain open in law enforcement databases, their disappearances attributed to voluntary departure or other explanations that don't account for the possibility that they were successfully abducted by traffickers who had learned to use the tools of modern romance to identify and capture victims who thought they were simply looking for love in the digital age. Let's move to our 6th story. Frank Williams had been driving cross-country in their Winnebago for 12 years since retirement, and he thought he and his wife Dorothy had mastered every aspect of life on the road. They'd weathered desert storms in Arizona, navigated mountain passes in Colorado, and survived bitter cold snaps in Montana, always finding safety and comfort in the routine of their mobile lifestyle. Their Winnebago wasn't just a vehicle, it was their home, their sanctuary, their testament to the freedom that retirement had finally afforded them after decades of postal service routines and mortgage payments. But their overnight stop at a rural Oklahoma Walmart would shatter every assumption they'd made about safety on America's highways, teaching them that predators had evolved to hunt the very travelers who thought their mobility made them safe. The Walmart in Henrietta, Oklahoma seemed like the perfect place to spend the night. Well-lit parking lot, 24-hour accessibility, and the implicit security that comes from corporate policies designed to welcome RV travelers seeking convenient overnight stops. Frank had parked their 30-foot Winnebago in the designated area at the far end of the lot, away from regular customer traffic, but close enough to the store to feel connected to civilization and assistance if needed. They'd followed their standard evening routine, grocery shopping for supplies, a quiet dinner of canned soup and grilled cheese sandwiches while watching the local news, and preparation for another comfortable night's sleep in the bed they'd carried with them across 43 states. Everything about the evening felt routine and safe until Dorothy happened to glance out the window and notice they were being watched. 3 pickup trucks sat in a perfect line about 50 yards from their RV, all facing toward the Winnebago, with their engines running and headlights off, positioned with the kind of tactical precision that suggested coordination rather than coincidence. The trucks hadn't been there when they'd arrived for grocery shopping 2 hours earlier, which meant their occupants had arrived specifically to observe the Williams family and their expensive recreational vehicle. Dorothy's first instinct was to dismiss her concerns as paranoia. Rural Oklahoma had plenty of pickup trucks, and Walmart parking lots attracted all kinds of overnight traffic. But as she continued watching, the vehicles never moved, never showed any signs of normal customer behavior, and never gave any indication that their occupants were there for legitimate shopping purposes. Frank's military experience from the Korean War had taught him to recognize tactical positioning when he saw it, and what he observed through the RV's window triggered every survival instinct he'd developed during his service overseas. The 3 trucks weren't randomly parked. They were strategically positioned to control access to the main road, block potential escape routes, and maintain visual surveillance on the Winnebago from multiple angles. This wasn't coincidence or convenience. This was a coordinated operation, designed to isolate and control his family's movement. And Frank had lived long enough to understand that such operations were never conducted for benevolent purposes. By 11 p.m., the psychological warfare began in earnest. The trucks started honking their horns in sequence, one short blast from each vehicle, repeated every few minutes in a pattern that was clearly intentional and designed to prevent sleep while creating stress and anxiety in their targets. The timing was precise, just frequent enough to maintain constant tension without creating enough noise to attract attention from store employees or other customers who might still be in the area. Frank attempted to call local police for assistance, but his cell phone showed no signal despite having full coverage when they'd arrived earlier in the evening. Dorothy's phone was similarly affected, both devices displaying no service indicators that suggested their communications were being jammed by equipment specifically designed to isolate victims from potential assistance. The horn pattern continued for 2 hours, creating a sleep deprivation torture that Frank recognized from military training as a technique used to break down resistance and prepare victims for whatever was planned for them. But at 2 a.m., the tactics escalated from psychological pressure to direct physical intimidation when one person from each truck exited their vehicle and began walking around the Winnebago in slow, deliberate circles. Frank could see their silhouettes. Through the RV's curtains, dark figures who moved with the patient confidence of predators, who knew their prey had nowhere to run and no way to call for help. The circling continued for over an hour, a ritual that seemed designed to demonstrate complete control over the situation while building terror in their victims. The most frightening aspect of the circling wasn't the implied threat, but the professional competence it demonstrated. These weren't random criminals or opportunistic thieves. They were organized operators who understood surveillance, intimidation, and victim psychology. They knew exactly how to create maximum terror while maintaining plausible deniability if law enforcement happened to arrive, and their coordination suggested extensive practice in this type of operation. Frank armed himself with a tire iron and positioned himself near the RV's door while Dorothy gathered their important documents and cash, both of them preparing for the possibility that they might need to abandon their home on wheels and everything they'd accumulated during 12 years of retirement travel. At 3:15 a.m. the circling stopped, but the silence that followed was more terrifying than the movement had been. Frank heard new sounds from beneath the RV. Tapping, scratching, and eventually the unmistakable noise of power tools being used on metal. Someone was crawling under their Winnebago with equipment designed to cut through the floor, bypassing the locked doors and windows that represented their primary defense against intrusion. The methodical nature of the cutting suggested that this technique had been used before, that Frank and Dorothy had become victims of a robbery method specifically designed to target RV travelers who thought their mobility and self-contained lifestyle provided protection from the criminals who hunted in retail parking lots. Frank realized that their attackers possessed not just coordination and equipment, but also technical knowledge about RV construction and vulnerabilities. They knew exactly where to cut to gain access while minimizing structural damage that might be discovered later, and they had tools sophisticated enough to penetrate the floor quickly and quietly. This wasn't improvised criminality, but a professional operation that targeted RV travelers specifically, using techniques that suggested extensive experience in this type of robbery and possibly training from someone with construction or mechanical expertise. Faced with imminent invasion of their home, Frank made a desperate decision that probably saved their lives. He started the RV's engine and began driving toward the store, hoping to reach the building's security cameras or attract attention from night employees before his attackers could complete their breach of the vehicle's floor. But the three trucks immediately moved to block his path, playing a deadly game of chicken with a 30-foot recreational vehicle whose occupants had nowhere else to go. Frank had to stop or risk a collision that might have killed them all while providing their attackers with the perfect cover story for whatever violence followed. Salvation came from an unexpected source when a long-haul trucker pulled into the Walmart parking lot for his own overnight rest and immediately recognized what was happening. The truck driver got on his CB radio and began broadcasting that there was a robbery in progress at the Henrietta Walmart, using the trucking community's communication network to summon help faster than any 911 call could have reached local law enforcement. Within minutes, multiple truckers were converging on the parking lot with their air horns blasting and headlights blazing, creating enough noise and attention to destroy the careful isolation that the RV hunters had worked to maintain. The three pickup trucks vanished into the rural Oklahoma darkness before police arrived, but they left behind evidence of their intentions: power tools, pry bars, and a partial cut through the RV's floor that would have allowed entry within another 10 minutes. The investigating officers explained that this gang had been hitting RV travelers across eastern Oklahoma using the same pattern every time: isolate the victims, jam communications, breach the vehicle from below, and rob the occupants who were trapped inside their own homes. Frank and Dorothy had been targeted not randomly, but as part of a systematic hunting operation that used the predictable patterns of retirement travel to identify and victimize people who thought their mobility provided safety from criminals, who had learned to turn that mobility into a trap. Frank and Dorothy Williams sold their Winnebago 2 months after their encounter with the RV hunters, abandoning 12 years of retirement dreams for the safety of stationary living in a community where neighbors could hear screams and police response times were measured in minutes rather than hours. They'd learned that the freedom of the road comes with vulnerabilities that no amount of experience can fully prepare travelers for, and that criminals had evolved to exploit the very independence that made RV travel attractive to retirees seeking adventure in their golden years. The psychological impact of their encounter extended far beyond the immediate terror of that night in the Walmart parking lot. Frank and Dorothy had discovered that the landscape of retirement travel was populated by predators who studied their victims' habits, mapped their vulnerabilities, and waited patiently for opportunities to strike in the vast empty spaces between cities where help was scarce and escape was impossible. Their experience became part of a federal investigation into organized retail crime that revealed networks of criminals who specialized in targeting RV travelers, using social media and travel forums to track potential victims and coordinate attacks at retail locations across the interstate highway system. The case files showed dozens of similar incidents. RV travelers robbed, assaulted, and sometimes murdered in retail parking lots by gangs who had perfected techniques for breaching recreational vehicles and neutralizing the communication systems that their victims depended on for emergency assistance. Frank and Dorothy's testimony contributed to a database that law enforcement agencies used to track patterns and identify hotspots where organized criminals hunted retired travelers who thought their greatest danger came from mechanical breakdowns or bad weather rather than human predators who had learned to weaponize the isolation and vulnerability that were inherent aspects of life on the road. The most disturbing revelation from their investigation was how sophisticated the criminal networks had become, using technology and tactics borrowed from military special operations to hunt civilians whose only crime was seeking the freedom and adventure that retirement was supposed to provide. The signal jammers, the coordinated positioning, the specialized tools for breaching RV floors, everything pointed to organized operations with extensive resources and training, suggesting that what Frank and Dorothy had encountered was not random criminality but professional hunting that targeted the specific vulnerabilities of America's growing population of RV travelers. Their story serves as a warning to the millions of retirees who have embraced the RV lifestyle, believing that mobility and self-sufficiency provide protection from the crimes that plague stationary communities. Frank and Dorothy learned that predators had evolved to exploit those very qualities that made RV travel attractive, turning the wide-open spaces and retail parking lots of rural America into hunting grounds where retired couples became prey. For criminals who understood that the most effective attacks target victims' assumptions about where they are safe and where danger might be waiting in the darkness beyond the reach of city lights and neighbors who might hear calls for help. Let's move to our seventh story. Ashley Burke had managed retail operations for 15 years, working her way up from cashier to assistant manager to district supervisor through sheer determination and an encyclopedic understanding of inventory, systems, employee management, and loss prevention protocols. When she accepted the night manager position at the Cedar Rapids Walmart, she thought she was prepared for any challenge the job might present. Employee theft, customer disputes, vendor irregularities, and the 1,000 small crises that occurred in retail operations after the sun went down and corporate oversight shifted to skeleton crews and automated systems. What Ashley discovered during her first month on the job would shatter her understanding of her workplace and her community, revealing that some patterns are too horrifying to ignore, and some secrets are buried in the most mundane aspects of corporate data analysis. Ashley's discovery began with routine inventory reconciliation, the kind of detailed number crunching that separates competent managers from those who simply react to problems after they've already caused significant financial damage. Her job required identifying shrinkage patterns, understanding where inventory disappeared, which departments experienced the highest losses, and what environmental factors contributed to theft, damage, or administrative errors that affected the store's profitability. She spent hours each night analyzing reports generated by the store's sophisticated tracking systems, looking for anomalies that might indicate employee theft, vendor fraud, or customer behavior that required intervention from security personnel or law enforcement agencies. But buried in the routine data was something that made no business sense whatsoever. A pattern of parking lot usage that defied every normal explanation for customer behavior or employee activity. Every Tuesday night for the past 6 months, 15 to 20 vehicles had been arriving at the store's parking lot around 1 a.m., parking in the furthest section from the building and remaining there for exactly 2 hours before departing simultaneously. These weren't employees. Their schedules were tracked and accounted for in different systems. They weren't customers. The store had been closed for hours when these vehicles arrived. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidence, too coordinated to be random social gathering, and too precise to be anything other than deliberately planned activity that someone wanted to keep hidden from casual observation. Ashley pulled the security camera footage for the previous Tuesday night, expecting to find a simple explanation that would allow her to dismiss her concerns and return to more mundane aspects of store management. What she discovered instead was something that challenged her fundamental assumptions about her workplace and the community she'd called home for most of her adult life. The vehicles arrived separately but parked in a specific geometric pattern that created a circle with an empty space in the center, like some kind of ritual formation or tactical arrangement designed for a specific purpose that had nothing to do with retail commerce or normal social interaction. The people who emerged from these vehicles weren't engaged in any behavior that resembled normal customer activity or social gathering. They remained near their cars, occasionally accessing items from their trunks or engaging in brief conversations with other participants, but always maintaining the circular formation and always keeping the center space clear, as if waiting for something or someone to occupy that position. Ashley watched 6 months of accumulated footage, and the pattern never varied. Same vehicles, same people, same ritual behavior, same mysterious purpose that brought them to her store's parking lot every Tuesday at the same time for activities. That appeared to have nothing to do with shopping or any other legitimate business. The footage from the most recent Tuesday night contained something that made Ashley's blood freeze and immediately transformed her curiosity into a moral imperative that demanded law enforcement intervention. In addition to the regular participants, someone else had been brought to the gathering, a person who hadn't arrived in their own vehicle, but had been escorted to the center of the circle by 2 other participants. This person was clearly struggling, attempting to resist or escape, but was held in position by multiple participants while the others formed their characteristic circle around the central space. The scene looked like nothing so much as a ritual or ceremony, but the resistance of the central figure suggested something far more sinister than any religious or social gathering. Ashley called the FBI instead of local police because her retail experience had taught her to recognize when situations exceeded the capabilities or jurisdiction of local law enforcement agencies. What she'd discovered wasn't a simple crime, but a pattern that suggested organized criminal activity spanning months and possibly involving multiple jurisdictions or federal crimes that required specialized investigation techniques and resources. Federal agents arrived within hours of her call, bringing with them equipment and expertise that confirmed Ashley's worst suspicions about what had been happening in her store's parking lot while she'd been focused on inventory reports and employee schedules inside the building. The FBI investigation revealed that Ashley had uncovered a human trafficking operation that used retail parking lots as temporary holding and processing sites where victims were documented, photographed and prepared for transport to final destinations where they would disappear into a criminal underworld that most Americans never suspected existed in their communities. The Cedar Rapids Walmart had been chosen specifically because of its location at the intersection of 2 major highways, its minimal overnight foot traffic, and its security camera system that created predictable blind spots in the furthest parking. areas where illegal activities could be conducted without detection from store employees or security personnel. The trafficking ring had been operating a sophisticated logistics network that treated human beings like merchandise, using retail locations as distribution centers, where victims were processed and sorted according to age, gender, and other characteristics that determined their value in various illegal markets. Ashley's parking lot had served as one node in a network that spanned multiple states, a place where traffickers could conduct their business with minimal risk of detection, because most people assumed that criminal activity happened in dark alleys or abandoned buildings rather than in the brightly lit parking lots of America's most recognizable retail chains. Physical evidence found in the parking lot included zip ties, duct tape, cell phone jammers designed to prevent victims from calling for help, and most horrifying of all, personal belongings from over 30 different individuals. The belongings suggested that the operation had been much larger and more active than even the FBI had suspected, processing dozens of victims through Ashley's parking lot during the months that she'd been analyzing inventory shrinkage and employee productivity reports, while remaining completely unaware of the human trafficking operation that was using her workplace as a staging area for crimes against humanity. Ashley's discovery that she could have intervened earlier if she'd been paying attention to the right data became the most difficult aspect of her experience to process emotionally. The pattern had been visible in her store's tracking systems for months, documented in security footage that she could have accessed at any time, occurring on a predictable schedule that would have made law enforcement intervention relatively straightforward if she'd recognized the significance of what she was observing. Her focus on traditional retail metrics had blinded her to criminal activity that was literally happening in her workplace's backyard every week with clockwork regularity. The FBI's investigation resulted in arrests in 7 states and the rescue of 18 victims who were still being held at various stages of the trafficking pipeline. But the case also revealed the sophisticated evolution of modern trafficking operations that had learned to exploit the infrastructure and patterns of legitimate commerce to conduct their criminal activities. Retail parking lots, truck stops, shopping malls, and other commercial locations provided perfect cover for illegal activities because they were public enough to avoid suspicion, but large enough to allow private meetings and transactions without attracting unwanted attention from law enforcement or security personnel. Ashley learned that her discovery wasn't unique. Similar operations had been uncovered at retail locations across the country, always following the same pattern of using commercial infrastructure to support criminal activities that most employees and customers never suspected were happening in their midst. The trafficking networks had evolved beyond the stereotypical image of criminals operating in dark, abandoned locations, instead embedding themselves in the normal patterns of American commercial life, where their activities could be disguised as legitimate business meetings or social gatherings. The psychological impact of Ashley's discovery extended far beyond the immediate satisfaction of helping to dismantle a criminal network and rescue trafficking victims. She'd learned that her workplace, which she'd considered a familiar and safe environment, had been serving as a staging area for crimes that represented the worst aspects of human exploitation and violence. The parking lot where she'd walked alone countless times during night shifts, the security cameras she'd relied on for safety, the routine patterns of retail operations she'd mastered over 15 years of professional experience, all of it had been compromised by criminals who understood how to exploit the blind spots and assumptions that made their illegal activities possible. Ashley now works as a consultant, training retail managers to recognize signs of trafficking operations in their parking lots and teaching them how to analyze data patterns that might indicate criminal activity disguised as normal commercial or social behavior. Her experience transformed her from someone who counted merchandise to someone who works to protect human lives, using her expertise in retail operations and data analysis to help other managers understand that their parking lots aren't just empty space but territory that can be exploited by criminals who've learned to hide their activities in the most public and seemingly safe locations. The most chilling aspect of Ashley's story isn't what she discovered about the trafficking operation, but what her experience suggests about how many other retail locations might be serving similar purposes without their employees or customers ever realizing what's happening in their parking lots after closing time. Her case became part of a federal database that tracks similar criminal operations, but law enforcement agencies acknowledge that the scope of the problem is likely much larger than current detection and prosecution statistics suggest, with trafficking. Networks continuing to exploit the infrastructure of American commerce to conduct their criminal activities in plain sight. Ashley's warning to other retail managers is simple but profound. Parking lots aren't neutral space. Security cameras aren't foolproof protection, and routine patterns in business data might be revealing criminal activities that demand immediate intervention. Her story serves as a reminder that heroism sometimes consists of nothing more than paying attention to the right details and having the courage to act when patterns suggest that something terrible is happening in places where most people never think to look for evidence of crimes against humanity. The Cedar Rapids trafficking ring was dismantled, but Ashley's discovery raised questions that continue to haunt law enforcement agencies and retail security professionals. How many other parking lots are being used for similar purposes? How many other employees are analyzing data that contains evidence of criminal activity they don't recognize? And how many other victims are being processed through the normal landscape of American commerce by criminals who've learned that the best place to hide evil is in the most familiar and public locations, where no one thinks to look for signs of systematic human exploitation?